Hello and welcome. You're watching Latitude at Frontline. 5 years after the Chinese military actions in Eastern Ladakh in April 2020 upended a carefully nurtured relationship, the two capitals are making attempts to normalize ties. Official bilateral engagements have picked up. Indian pilgrims went for the Kailash Mansarovar yatra after a long gap of 5 years. What does this mean and where does it all fit in India's regional and global goals amid a constant geopolitical flux? I'm Nirupama Subramanian, the host of this show, and I have with me today Vijay Gokhale, India's former Foreign Secretary and India's former ambassador to China. Since his retirement in 2020, he has also become a prolific author. He's written several books on China. These include an eyewitness account of the Tiananmen Square protests and China's crackdown on it, and most importantly, a book called The Long Game, How China Negotiates with India, and he has updated it with a chapter on the Galwan crisis just last month. Mr. Gokhale, welcome to Latitude.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Mr. Gokhale, we've had a flurry of high-level India-China meetings in recent days. And after visits to China by the National Security Advisor, Mr. A.K. Doval, and the Defense Minister, Mr. Rajnath Singh, for meetings of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, as well as for bilateral meetings, it's also being reported that the External Affairs Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, will also travel to China next week, and he'll probably hold bilateral meetings as well. And Prime Minister Narendra Modi may also travel to China in August for the SCO summit. The two sides, as I said, the two sides have resumed the Kailash Yatra. Civilian flights may resume soon. On the other hand, the border situation is still not entirely resolved. Additionally, Operation Sindoor revealed how closely the Chinese actually worked with the Pakistan militarily. So how do we reconcile all these contradictory developments to arrive at a broader picture of where India-China relations are at this point and where are they headed?
I would describe India-China relations at the moment as being in a state of uneasy equilibrium. Essentially, the framework that was evolved after 1990, after the visit of Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi to China, broke down during the Galwan crisis in 2020. And in my opinion, the framework cannot be retrieved. So what we are seeing at the moment is a state of armed coexistence. And for 4.5 years, negotiations took place to restore order and a certain sense of status quo on the border. Now, that was resolved in October 2024, partially because we have disengaged but not de-escalated. And as you correctly observed, political contacts resumed. We have now also resumed certain functional programs and contacts. But I have to say that of late, in the last few weeks, certain new elements have been introduced in the relationship, which is also causing further mistrust or misperception. And these are on both sides. On the Indian side, you would have seen a number of news reports about the sanctions that China is trying to place on export of certain commodities or technologies to India. For instance, there are export controls which have prevented the export of tunnel boring machines. We also understand that they are discouraging Chinese electric vehicle companies from transferring lithium-ion technology to India. And most recently, there is a report that China is putting pressure to recall its technicians and engineers who are working on the iPhone in Indian factories. So this is one area of concern for us. A second, of course, is, as you rightly observed, the support China gave to Pakistan on Operation Sindoor. On the Chinese side, there are also some concerns. One, again, is the recent controversy over the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama. You might recall that yesterday, during the birthday celebrations, a number of senior government functionaries were also present. And that would certainly be something not to China's liking. Secondly, very recently during the Quad foreign ministers meeting, the statement on the South China Sea and the East China Sea was, in my opinion, stronger and sharper than it has been in the past. So, in the past few years, the four foreign ministers of Quad have observed that unilateral actions are being taken to change the status quo, that certain maritime features are being militarized, and that certain actions like the use of water cannons or the ramming of fishing boats are being used to prevent activity. But this time, an additional sentence was contained in this statement, and it said these actions threaten peace and stability. Words that have not been used in previous Quad statements. And to my mind, this is very directly aimed at China. And therefore, I think China would be unhappy with that as well. Now, as you correctly pointed out, a number of opportunities are going to come up in the next 2 weeks to restore some sort of balance to the relationship, including the visits by the External Affairs Minister and later the Prime Minister for the summit, for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit, as well as, I understand, a visit by the Chinese special representative on the boundary question to India later this month. But on the other hand, what the outcome of this will be difficult because, as I said, there are layers of misperception which have built up over the past few years, and these have to be gradually unpeeled and resolved one by one. And therefore, to predict at this point where that relationship may go is difficult. What I can say is that the state of armed coexistence will remain for a long while to come until trust is restored. And given the uncertainties in the global situation, both countries will also be exploring other options and other relationships, which might complicate the India-China relationship.
Right. Thank you so much for that very richly detailed response. I just want to now ask you about your book, The Long Game, How the Chinese Negotiate with India. You took 6 episodes in the India-China relationship, including the Pokhran Test, Sikkim, Tibet, and others, to study the Chinese strategies and tactics that they adopt when they negotiate with India. And now, as I mentioned earlier, you've added a new chapter to this book, which is about the Galwan crisis in 2020, in which you are talking about Chinese motives and the actions they took in Eastern Ladakh and what their objectives were, and how the negotiations went from there. So seeing that that has been the source of all the trouble that has followed in the Chinese, in the relationship, can we talk about this a bit? And also, how did India match up to China in these post-Galwan negotiations? Because we haven't really resolved anything. I mean, although we have resolved some of the issues at the border itself, at the LAC itself, the other tensions, as you mentioned, they remain. So can we talk about this?
Sure. I think there were 3 very interesting facets to this negotiation, which have not been seen previously and which I think people should look at much more carefully. In all the earlier negotiations we had on border violations, the violation happened at a single point of dispute. So in 2013, it was Depsang. In 2014, it was Chumar. In 2017, it was Doklam. This time, however, you had multiple points where the violations occurred, ranging for several hundred kilometers in Eastern Ladakh. So that was the first big difference. Secondly, in all earlier cases, the discussions were finished in a matter of weeks or a few months. In this case, the discussions went on for 4.5 long years. And lastly, in all previous disputes, diplomacy was at the center of the negotiations. In other words, the negotiations were being conducted primarily through the foreign offices. whereas this time the negotiations were primarily conducted through the militaries on both sides. So in that sense, the Galwan crisis is a learning experience because a number of elements which did not exist previously were manifest in this negotiation. Now, I also explain in my book why I thought this crisis occurred. And essentially, there were both local factors and broader strategic ones at play. The local factors basically included an increasing stress by the Chinese side on the real-time training of its troops. We must remember China has not fought a war in nearly half a century. And while they have all the modern weapons, their doctrines, their training, their ability to wage war, all are questionable simply because they have never had to face it. One of the things that President Xi Jinping has done since he assumed office was to ask all the theater commands to focus on real-time combat training. And my sense is that one of these training exercises was carried a little too far, and perhaps knowingly or unwittingly, it triggered the crisis. But there is also a larger strategic objective, I think, behind the Chinese doing the Galwan crisis. And that is an increasing feeling that they have that India is moving from a relatively neutral position to one that is tilting against the People's Republic of China. Now, if we look at India-China relations historically, the Chinese have tended at such times to apply force in an effort to correct the tilt. That happened in 1962, it happened in 1987, and it has been happening since 2014. It is another matter whether they have ever succeeded in correcting that tilt, and I have my own views on that. But I think that it was a combination of this larger strategic consideration and the very local considerations relating to training which triggered the crisis. Finally, since you have asked me how we have come out of this, I think first of all, we must acknowledge that after 4.5 years of negotiation, we did succeed in getting China to disengage on all the points of concern, despite China's best effort to separate some of them by saying they were legacy issues and were not involved in the crisis. And I think that really what the government of India displayed in this negotiation was three things. Firstly, there was a clarity of goals. The government of India was very clear that all disputed pockets had to be resolved, and not just 1 or 2 or 5 of them. Secondly, very precise terminology was used. So the words disengagement, de-escalation, and de-induction were defined, and it was very clearly stated to the Chinese side that the second phase would happen only after the first phase was fully complete and not simultaneously. And lastly, there was a consistency in messaging, and I cannot stress the importance of this. There was clearly interagency coordination, as a result of which every department of the government, whether it was military or civilian, was talking in the same terms and in one voice. And that mattered where negotiations with China were concerned, because China could not use differences within the government of India to try and drive a wedge between them. The one idea I did leave behind in the book was a relatively new concept that the Chinese have introduced called hot shelving. In other words, we've all heard of cold shelving. You put away a problem for dealing in the future. Hot shelving is an idea where you put the problem away on a high shelf, but to keep it bubbling and boiling so that the other side has to constantly deal with it without the Chinese side ever shelving the problem. So essentially, that is something which I thought I began to see the indications of that in this crisis. And I'm mentioning this because I want to come to the final point, which is that Galwan is not the end of the border disputes. The hot shelving idea, if in fact it pans out, means the Chinese will keep creating points of dispute along the line of actual control to keep you fully engaged militarily. in the hope that the cost that you pay, economically as well as politically, will at some point be too great to bear, and that you might therefore be more amenable to negotiating with them.
As they did, in fact, in Arunachal Pradesh in December 2022, I think there was an attempt by the PLA there to take a post. Is that an example of what you're saying?
Precisely. That was the incident in a place called Yangtze in the eastern sector. And it was precisely that I was referring to. There have been other incidents as well, I understand.
Yeah.
And the idea is to constantly test you and to hopefully exhaust you, because it is a very, very long border. And you don't know where the test will be coming next. And therefore, you have to maintain heightened vigilance all the time at great cost.
So, yeah, that brings me to the next question, really, about, how this, in India's demand during the military standoff in Eastern Ladakh was a return to status quo ante. And we saw that the phrase was actually dropped after a while. But after disengagements in a few of the friction points, the Chinese insistence was that both sides should move on and place the border issue in an appropriate position in bilateral relations and basically start normalizing. So as a result, but then, as you said, India stuck on and they insisted that, all the friction points, there had to be disengagement. And as a result of the 4.5-year-long negotiations, both sides could achieve this disengagement at all the friction points, including at the two which they described as legacy issues, which was Depsang and Demchok. Then it was followed by a meeting immediately between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Xi Jinping at Kazan on the sidelines of the BRICS summit. And then an announcement was made that we will start bilateral engagement and towards normalization. My question really is, did we achieve what we started out demanding, a status quo ante in Eastern Ladakh?
Well, I will be honest in saying, Nirupama, that I really don't know, because the government has not specifically stated that. But what I can say from whatever I have gleaned from the media and from other sources is that in all those points of dispute, if we were pulled back a little in terms of ensuring peace and tranquility had to be maintained, the Chinese side also had to pull behind their claim in order to ensure that this stability could be maintained. So I think I can say that, yes, what I'm saying is that the Chinese side has also been denied access, I suspect, to a lot of places they were getting access to. And we have perhaps not been able to regain full access in some of the places we were going to. But the result is, in a sense, a buffer within which both sides will make coordinated patrols, which will keep the claims alive, but which will not allow in exclusive control. Beyond that, I really can't comment, because the government itself has not clarified what it means by full restoration of status quo.
You mentioned Operation Sindoor as well in your first response, and I just want to draw your attention to what Lieutenant General Rahul Singh, the Army's second senior-most officer, he recently made these remarks that India was fighting 3 adversaries during Operation Sindoor: Pakistan, China, and Turkey. So how does this actually complicate? How does this Chinese role complicate efforts at normalization?
Yeah, well, first of all, I am not well informed enough about China's specific military assistance to Pakistan, so I won't comment on that aspect. Essentially, China played by its standard playbook in such cases. It condemned the Pahalgam terrorist attack, but then it backed Pakistan's call for an independent inquiry. It also publicly declared support for Pakistan's sovereignty and territorial integrity when their foreign minister came calling in Beijing, both immediately before and after the crisis. And it also kept repeating the mantra that Pakistan has made important contributions to counter-terrorism, thereby undermining India's position that, in fact, Pakistan is the fountainhead of terrorism. Finally, of course, China played its usual role in the United Nations Security Council's informal discussion by removing any reference to Pakistan and Pakistan-based terrorists in the UN statement. So what we can see is China playing by its standard playbook of pretending to be balanced in public, but in fact taking a clear side in actual fact. Having said that, Nirupama, and without commenting on what assistance it may have given militarily, I don't think the Chinese were too keen to see an escalation in the situation, simply because the improvement or the stabilization of ties with India is still an important priority. At a time when there is a global uncertainty and when their own relations with the United States are in a parlous state. In such a situation, an escalation would have compelled them to either adopt a public position against India or to restrain Pakistan. And I don't think this was either choice was one which they were looking for. The second point I want to make is I think the Indian action in Operation Sindoor will make China pay far greater attention to India's capabilities, but more important, the whole idea that prevails in both Islamabad and Beijing that India is risk averse, that its strategic patience stretches endlessly to taking 1,000 cuts or more without responding. And if they really knit together the pattern that is forming after Uri, after Balakot, and after Galwan, the Operation Snow Leopard, and now this, I think in Beijing, almost certainly, there will be a review of whether India's entire strategic posture is changing. So I think this is what I would like to sort of say about China's role in Operation Sindoor and how it will look at the post-Sindoor situation.
So, we've seen India bring up Turkey's involvement in Operation Sindoor. India's taken some actions. It has blacklisted a Turkish firm that was handling some logistics operations at some airports. Also, I think there was a statement from MEA that, about how Turkey should asking Turkey to exercise some caution. But we haven't seen India doing the same with China. I'm not aware that it has actually come up in any discussion with China that they helped Pakistan. Although it has been said at the highest levels of the military here, this has not been brought up to the Chinese themselves. Is that deliberate on our part? I mean, are we exercising caution, or are we trying to dehyphenate our China relationship with our relationship with Pakistan and their relationship, the China-Pakistan relationship?
See, again, I can't speak to what government's thinking in the matter is, but I'm glad you brought up this question because Turkey's position in the whole matter was very different from China's. Turkey has not only given military, political, and diplomatic support during Operation Sindoor, but it has consistently brought up Kashmir at multilateral forums. If you recall, when Article 370 was repealed, it was Turkey which was the most vocal in saying that this would have a negative impact on the Jammu and Kashmir issue. When the operation in Balakot occurred, again, it was Turkey which voiced concerns and brought up the Kashmir issue. If I recall, in the last 2 or 3 UN General Assembly meetings, the Turkish president himself has brought up the Kashmir issue. And this time too, it was the Turks who flagged Kashmir as the issue, whereas Operation Sindoor was not about Jammu and Kashmir. It was about the targeting of civilians by terrorists based in Pakistan. And therefore, I presume, because I can't speak for government, government took a nuanced position in that it felt that Turkey's stance, not only on Operation Sindoor, but on the entire Kashmir issue, deserved a response. China, on the other hand, has been very circumspect on its pronouncements in the matter. Its standard position on Kashmir is that it should be solved bilaterally and in accordance with the UN Security Council resolutions, but it doesn't bring up the matter proactively in multilateral forums. And I think this differentiation needs to be understood. Now, whether this was behind the government's decision or not is something I cannot speak to.
Right, but in general, would you say that there is an effort on the Indian side to keep the India-China relationship separate from or to not hyphenate the China and Pakistan while dealing with China?
Well, what I would say is that we must not presume that what has not been said in public is not being said in private. It is entirely possible that we do raise such issues with China at private meetings, but we choose not to make it public. And that is because it is in India's interest too to have a balanced and stable relationship with China.
I now want to move to a question that is to an issue that's very current, and that is about the Dalai Lama and the succession issue. It's quite clear that Dalai Lama's message, that is incarnation, that is the 15th Dalai Lama, will be chosen in the traditional way by an inner circle of monks, and the person will be found outside China. The Chinese have rejected this and said the next Dalai Lama will be chosen by a method called the Golden Urn, which is sanctioned by the Beijing government. It's quite clear that India will be drawn into this controversy. What is the way forward for India on this? Because it's very tricky. India, has the official policy of India is that Tibet is a part of China. So where do we actually stand on this?
Right. Well, I've written very extensively on this whole matter in a paper I did for Carnegie India in November 2024. So if any of your listeners or viewers are interested, it's an open source working paper. But let me make first a central point, and that is, much as we often think this to be the case, India is not central to Chinese policy on Tibet and the Dalai Lama. The primary concerns there are two. First, the Chinese need to ensure that they have complete control politically on Tibet. And two, they are concerned at what the US posture and position and policy is. These are their primary concerns. On the other hand, we too have stakes in the matter of Tibetan Buddhism for two reasons. One, His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama lives in India and has been doing that for the past 60 years. And secondly, because Tibetan Buddhism is also considered one of India's religions, and there is a sizable population practicing that in India. Therefore, we are not a passive spectator either to what is happening in the matter of the reincarnation or what is happening inside Tibet, because the implications are a refugee inflow into India. Now, for 65 years, an uneasy modus vivendi existed between the two sides, with China coming to terms with the fact that His Holiness would continue to stay in India, and India giving assurances that they would not permit political activity and considered him as a spiritual and religious leader. But now that it is clear that upon the passing of the 14th Dalai Lama, there will be two Dalai Lamas, because China has said it will select one of its own, and His Holiness has made clear that there will be a new Dalai Lama, the 15th Dalai Lama from outside communist-controlled China. We are now faced with a very complex situation, because whereas the current Dalai Lama has been recognized by all parties, including the People's Republic of China, as the genuine article, in the case of the 15th Dalai Lama, this will not be the case. So a whole series of questions arise, and I frankly don't have the answers to any of them. But I am quite sure that government must be seized of these questions. The first is, if the 15th Dalai Lama is found in a third country, neither in China nor in India, but let's say in the West, will he be permitted to enter and reside in India? Because this is where a very substantial part of the community lives. Secondly, what if an Indian citizen is identified as the next Dalai Lama? What will the government of India's position be in that case? Because then you can't prevent him from coming in. He is already a citizen of the country. The third is, the Dalai Lama's ritual objects are all in India. And as you know, in spiritual tradition, those ritual objects pass from incarnation to incarnation. What is the position if the People's Republic of China were to demand the return of the ritual objects after the passing of the 14th Dalai Lama, on the grounds that these are Chinese historical artifacts? Then, of course, there's the question of how India deals with the interregnum between the passing of the 14th Dalai Lama and the selection and the growing up of the 15th. As you know, the next incarnation will be a child, and therefore a regency council is established as per practice. What will India's dealings be with that regency council? Lastly, and this is important, how will India manage the activities of the Tibetan community in exile after the current Dalai Lama passes? His own call for non-violence, his appeal to use peaceful means to liberate Tibet, has been, in a sense, a calming effect, has had a calming effect on the exile community. We have to ensure that that does not turn to violence after His Holiness passes. And therefore, it is important to have a policy, or at least some thinking on all these questions. As I said, I don't have the answers, but I'm quite sure that government would be seized of the matter and must be working on it.
So, when you talk about Tibetan Buddhism in India, it's usually practiced in, I would think that the main area where it's practiced would be Arunachal Pradesh, where...
I think so. I think it is equally practiced in all the Himalayan states. Sikkim, that's the main seat, for instance, of the Karmapa Lamas. In Himachal, because a lot of the Kanga Valley, Lahul and Spiti have priceless Tibetan documents in Tibetan monasteries, and almost all of the Union Territory of Ladakh. So there is a sizable geographical area and population which believes some form of Tibetan Buddhism, not necessarily the Gelugpa form, which is the Dalai Lama's form of Buddhism. But you have, as you know, in Tibet, 4 different sects: the Sakyapa, the Nyingmapa, the Karmapa, and the Gelugpa. And collectively, all the Himalayan states practice one or another form of Buddhism. And therefore, it's not just limited to the state of Arunachal Pradesh.
So it could complicate the situation at the LAC if the Chinese were to take umbrage at any possible Indian role in this whole controversy.
It might, but I think we already have enough complications without adding another one to it. So I don't think this is going to vastly change that. As I said, I anticipate a state of armed coexistence and the hot shelving of disputes over the next 10 years in any case.
I want to move to now the relations between China and the US. And, President Trump has had this blow hot, blow cold attitude to China. On the one hand, he says he admires President Xi Jinping. On the other, his tariff war has led to a standoff and now perhaps a climb down. And maybe President Trump is going to visit China in the near future. That's what reports suggest. You talked about how the Chinese have sensed, one of the motivations for Galwan was perhaps this tilt that they sensed against China in India's policies, a tilt against China. So where do India-China relations fit in this larger picture of US-China relations? And considering that our relations with US in the last 10 or so years have been much to do with being a bulwark against China in the Asia-Pacific region, if a US-China rapprochement takes place, where does that leave India?
So, of course, President Trump's priorities are very clear. They are domestic in focus. He needs to create jobs. He needs to get American growth going. He needs to rebuild American infrastructure. And since trade is a priority and China is the largest trading partner, the United States-China relationship is their most important relationship. We should have no doubt about that. President Trump engaged in a tariff war with China, extremely high tariffs and counter tariffs, and the tariff war hurt both of them. And therefore, some sort of a consensus has been reached in Geneva and in London over the last couple of months. But this is a framework in principle, and we need to see the details. Now, to think that Donald Trump has conceded would be a mistake in my view, because the tariff wars hurt both of them equally and had substantial implications for the Chinese economy. By all indications, Chinese job growth is slow, China's economic growth itself is slowing, and domestic consumption is not growing fast enough to absorb the losses from exports, from trade defense measures by other countries. So it is as much a compulsion for President Xi to reach a deal as it is for President Trump. And what they have reached is a truce in which some exports of semiconductors from the American side will be done in return for relaxation of export controls on rare earths, on magnets for electric vehicles, and so on the other side. Now, can a deal be done? It's difficult to say, but will the Americans do the deal if a reasonable proposal is made? I think that will happen. Because, as I said, President Trump's priority is domestic. Will that lead to a political rapprochement at a broader level? I think it's unlikely. Because in the United States, there is bipartisan consensus that China is the pacing challenge. And even if you look at the one big beautiful bill, there is a substantial increase in defense expenditures. And we know who their primary rival or adversary is. So, in my view, there will be the possibility of a trade deal. It might have some implication on India because a certain amount of political relaxation could also take place, but it is unlikely that this will be fundamentally different from the administrations past, which is Obama and Biden, both of whom did also in their own way reach deals with China. And the India-US relationship will continue to hold strategic importance in Washington. I am not in agreement with you when you say that the main pillar of this relationship is China. It might be one of the considerations, but I think equally important, perhaps more important, are the fact that this is the only country, the United States, from which we can get both technology and capital. And both are vital if we really want to grow the economy to the $10 trillion mark and beyond. In technology in particular, we have fallen behind China in a very big way. And if there is any hope of catching up, it is through self-help, but bolstered or supplemented with American technologies and American assistance. So that relationship is well beyond China as far as we are concerned. And the whole ISET initiative, which is now repackaged as the Trust Initiative, is at the centerpiece, is at the core of that relationship. So I think we should not give too much of a prominence to China in that relationship, while of course acknowledging that China is certainly one element at play there.
Right. So you spoke about how the India-US relationship holds much more importance than just being a bulwark against China. Yet some American policy thinkers want India to get more involved militarily. in the South China Sea and in the Taiwan Strait. And we had a foreign policy thinker, a prominent foreign policy thinker in the US, saying that India should also allow more foreign military to operate in and around India to boost interoperability with key partners. He said this, I'm making a reference to L.I. Ratner, who said this in an interview to Hindustan Times recently. What are your views on this?
Well, I've seen Eli Ratner's interview, and the thrust of his interview was that Quad would not become a significant partnership unless India committed to supporting American goals in the Western Pacific. Now, that is a point of view that he has. The question we have to ask ourselves are, first, do we have the capabilities to project power in the Western Pacific? And secondly, are we politically willing to commit to a broader security relationship with the United States, in which we involve our military at some point in the defense of their interests? And that brings me to the question as to whether a reciprocal commitment might be made by the United States when it comes to India's national security. So the question then that begs itself is, in the event of a potential conflict between India and China, or of a conflict between India on the one side and Pakistan and China on the other, or even on the question of an India-Pakistan conflict, will America do what it expects India to do in a China-US conflict? Certainly, the recent experience of Operation Sindoor does not entirely convince me of this. The United States undoubtedly must have helped us, but it also played a balancing role in this whole thing. And therefore, we need to ask ourselves as Indians whether a complete commitment to American interests in the Western Pacific suits us. Now, that's not a question that I can answer, nor does it matter what I say, because it is ultimately government which determines policy. And they have to come up with an answer to this. But what I do want to say is that there are common interests between the two, vital interests that involve India's security, not just from a military or diplomatic perspective, but from an economic and technological perspective as well. And we share those interests with other countries like Japan and Australia. And therefore, institutions like Quad or platforms like Quad will continue to be important. Whether or not it becomes a military platform or a security platform, as Eli Ratner wants it to be, is another matter.
Right. Even as a non-security grouping, can Quad actually overcome the tensions that that are now evident between Trump and Japan? India's own problems with the Trump administration, and then also Trump's dumping of AUKUS, the deal under which they were supposed to transfer technology for nuclear-powered submarines to Australia in collaboration with the US. So, I mean, this whole grouping itself seems to be having a lot of individual tensions. The countries in the grouping have individual tensions with the US. So what is the future of this?
I think we would be missing the wood for the trees if we did not understand that the United States is questioning all its commitments. It is auditing all its commitments. That includes NATO as well. It includes bilateral commitments to Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. It includes AUKUS as well. And that is in keeping with President Trump's whole approach that he needs to find more money to fund the domestic resurgence of the United States. And a logical corollary of that is that the partners must take up a greater part of the defense expenditure. Therefore, to single out Japan or to single out Australia or AUKUS or even to single out India, to suggest that the problems are unique to them is, I think, a fallacious argument. That does not mean that the United States is going to give up its core interests in the Western Pacific. Because if it does, it will no longer be a global power. It will be a regional power. And I think every US president is committed to keeping the primacy of the United States alive in this world. So I think that Quad, along with all the other plurilateral and bilateral mechanisms that the United States is involved in, will undergo some sort of an audit. But at the end of it, the United States recognizes that these three partners are perhaps the only three partners in the entire Indo-Pacific which have both a relatively large economic capability and a relatively independent military capability to act. There is no other country or even groups of countries like ASEAN which have both an economic heft and a military capability to act. And therefore, I believe Quad will retain its relevance.
Right. I just have one last question, and that is about what's happening in China itself. Much of what we've been discussing now has much to do with China's trajectory under President Xi Jinping's leadership. But there's strong rumors of a transition in Beijing itself, and that President Xi Jinping may be retired soon, or he may be considering stepping down, and he started delegating his responsibilities already. And he has not attended the BRICS summit that's ongoing. So what's going on really? What can you tell us about this?
Well, nobody knows, Nirupama. Perhaps only one man knows. But I would be skeptical unless there is far more substantive evidence that he is planning to step down. It is possible that he may give up one or even two of his positions, namely because he has three positions: the President of the People's Republic of China, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, and the Chairman of the Central Military Commission. It is possible he may give up one of these jobs, as Deng Xiaoping did in 1989 and then, in 1980, and then Jiang Zemin also did in 2003. And both of them for a while retained the position of chairman of the Central Military Commission because, as Mao famously said, power springs from the barrel of the gun. But in this case, I am even skeptical about that. Simply because after 15 years in power, during which he has ruthlessly dealt with his enemies, real and imagined, he is sitting on the back of the tiger, and it is difficult to get off that. Now, a couple of other indicators suggest to me that it is not likely that he will be able to give up power that easily. The first is the widespread purges which are taking place in the military and in the internal security apparatus. Purges do not indicate a sense of security. It suggests the opposite. It suggests that the top leader is insecure because he or she might feel a threat to their power. It is a very Stalinist mode of inducing terror because you're not sure that otherwise the rank and file will back you in a crisis. So that is one indication to me that it's not likely he will give up power. The other one is, a newspaper articles which have come out in the last couple of days, which are pointing to a meeting of the Central Committee, which is standardizing or institutionalizing mechanisms in an effort to ensure that they are not person dependent. And this is again being shown as an indication of his readiness to step down. But if you really look at what Xi Jinping has done over the past 15 years, it has in fact been to institutionalize his power. He has instituted a system which is known by the Chinese phrase "Tifa." It means rule by law. We as democracies talk of rule of law. The law prevails. In his case, Tifa is rule by law. Rule prevails because it is now backed by legal sanction. If you look at what he has done in all areas, it is to introduce legal provisions to back his seizure of power and the concentration of power away from the state to the party. That process has now continued with the institutionalization of that power within the party. But of course, he holds the chairmanship of all the major commissions within the party as well, or the leading groups within the party as well. Therefore, to simply think that by institutionalizing, he is preparing the grounds for renouncing his power is, I think, jumping too quickly to conclusions. I'm not ruling it out. Nobody can, because as I frankly admitted, nobody knows. But all indications, as well as a study of Chinese history over the past 100 years, suggests that leaders have not relinquished power easily. Transitions have always been messy in China, except when Deng Xiaoping introduced the term limits for the presidency, which President Xi has now removed. And therefore, there is an even chance that the next transition will be a messy one as well, rather than a very orderly stepping down of one leader and a handing of power to the other.
For sure, we'll be watching the developments in China and we'll probably come back to you. But for now, Mr. Vijay Gokhale, thank you so much for sharing your vast knowledge of China with our viewers. It was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you, viewers, for watching this episode. I will be back next week with another episode of Latitude.
Thank you.